Sound, within any moving image product, is vital in today's modern media to aid with storytelling and immerse an audience into a production. But in the early ages of cinema, sound wasn't always as pivotal as it is today. But it wasn't until the late 1920s and early 30s that films really started to be influenced by sound design. Sound design began to emerge within cinema with the invention of talkie productions, most notably with 1927's The Jazz Singer. This was the first major motion picture to have a soundtrack that included dialogue, despite the fact that this was only displayed through musical numbers and select conversations. It wasn't until a year after, in 1928, when landmark company Warner Bros. Produced their Vitaphone film, The Lights of New York, where dialogue truly came to life on the big screen. Beginning with one of the most critically acclaimed filmmakers of the early 20th century, Jack Foley. Foley, within sound, is the process that involves creating and performing everyday sounds for film and television. Foley artists create these sounds in a recording studio during post-production in synchrony of the picture to enhance the quality of the audio. This technique was first pioneered when Universal was getting ready to release a silent film version of Hammerstein's II Broadway musical Showboat in 1928. That's when one Universal employee, Jack Foley, came up with the idea of watching the film and recording live sound effects to go with the visual gestures. Jack Foley can single-handedly be credited with this indispensable part of moving image sound, with the craft eventually being named after him despite the fact that during his 33 years at Universal Studios, he never received an on-screen credit for his groundbreaking inventive. This incredibly influential piece of sound is important because by adding sound over the post-production process, a sound designer has complete and utter control over the timing and quality of their sound within a production, which also allows them to alter whenever necessary. Within the productions of today, without added Foley, a film's atmosphere doesn't really sound alive and can often end up falling flat. Following in suit of Jack Foley, in 1933, Murray Spivak pioneered one of the many techniques that are used to manipulate sound today within King Kong's sound design. In order to create audible sounds from monsters that didn't exist, Spivak went to the zoo, gathering roars from a collection of animals, slowed them down half speed, choosing to play the tiger growl specifically backwards, therefore giving life to the iconic eponymous ape. Similar sound design techniques are still used today. During this time, Spivak was locked away in the music department, with nobody really taking into consideration just what it was he was doing. Most landmark companies had their own pre-existing sound collections, which would be repeated and never changed over the years. If these sound effects were considered successful, they would be kept, with no need for innovative explorations into sound like Spivak was creating. History proved that Spivak's techniques were a success, with him going on to work at 20th Century Fox for 17 years, working on the likes of Oklahoma, Cleopatra and West Side Story, for which he won a Personal Academy Award, proving his place in the ever-developing world of sound design. Moving ahead in terms of modern cinema, in 1975, George Lucas created Skywalker Sound and hired Ben Burtt, whose job title at the time was described as a director of sound, someone who could imagine and implement a creative soundtrack to match revolutionary visuals planned for a low-budget sci-fi film called Star Wars. Little did the duo know, but this series of films would go on to become some of the most influential and prolific films of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, paving the way for the continuation of modern sci-fi. Within the first Star Wars production in 1977, titled A New Hope, Burtt had one of the most toughest jobs within production. Tasked with producing original sounds for a myriad of objects that didn't really exist, he had to dig much deeper to come up with ideas for compelling audio effects. This was much like the work of his predecessor Spivak. Within an interview asking him what inspired one of the most synonymous sounds of the franchise, the lightsaber, Burtt revealed that his inspiration actually came from the humming sounds of an idle video projector. Immediately something went off in my mind and I had a feeling for what they might sound like. The booth where we projected the films, those projectors made a hum. The motors would sit there with this magical, mysterious humming sound. I thought, that's probably what a lightsaber would sound like. With these pioneers paving the way for what we now expect from sound design, landmark companies come hand in hand to create the silver screen sound, with one of these most notably being Dolby Stereo. Ray Dolby founded Dolby Laboratories in 1965 when movies and television only featured one channel of sound and record producers were limited to a handful of audio tracks. Much of what has happened in terms of sound advancements since the age of Dolby can be credited solely to the company and Ray's work, not just the technological innovations, but also the impact they have had on others. When reflecting on the monumental change in sound that Ray gave to the cinema industry after his death, Ben Burtt said that he was a scientist who invented tools for artists, and so you get the blend of the two important cornerstones of entertainment, which is science and creativity. The result of this was a whole new frontier opening. His work in creating a monumental landmark company can be summed up as him being an inventor for future artists, specifically when it comes to the advancement of surround sound. In 1971, the first movie with Dolby Sound, A Clockwork Orange, was released, a movie which featured a great deal of classical music. This music was rendered more enjoyable for audiences thanks to Dolby noise reduction technology. After this, Dolby Labs started moving towards what would become a major invention for them. First experienced by movie audiences in the 1976 release of A Star is Born, Dolby Stereo now had 4 channels. Since this technological advancement in cinema sound, cinemas soon began to globally kit up their theatres with Dolby Stereo in order to give audiences the most immersive experience into productions. Ray's work in creating a landmark company had become so influential that Dolby is now the industry standard in cinema sound today. The work of Warner Bros. Also had a monumental impact within the industry of sound. Despite the fact that Dolby is arguably the most recognised company in today's media, Warner Bros. Was probably one of the first studios to initiate a post-production department where soundtracks could be prepared and mastered in quantity. This allowed sound and image to be synchronised much easier and allowed filmmakers to begin adding sound into film, something that has been adapted freely in today's modern cinema, with Warner Bros. Paving the way for this industry norm. In today's modern media, to create their sound, Warner Bros. Are using Pro Tools exclusively for sound editorial and mixing, with a choice of DAW-based control surfaces, as well as traditional consoles for re-recording. Looking now specifically at the genre of science fiction, 3 of the most iconic and influential sound designs come from The Day the Earth Stood Still, Star Wars: A New Hope, and Gravity. The Day the Earth Stood Still is a sci-fi genre released in the early 50s, directed by Robert Wise, working alongside composer Bernard Herrmann. Herrmann already had experience working on a similar production and had a taste of what alien invasion could sound like, having conducted the live music for Orson Welles' infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast. The score for the film came from a mix of odd instruments, creating groundbreaking sound by combining electric violin, bass, cello, with organs, glockenspiels, harps, tubas, and pianos, in order to create an uneasy feeling resonate with the audience, creating a fear of the unknown right from the opening credits. But what really set this 50s classic apart from the others of its time was the use of the theremin, an instrument played by waving your hands over its antennas, creating electromagnetic waves compared to that of otherworldly sounds. Having not been heard like this before on a big screen, it set audiences on high alert. It had been used before within films, but never to create tension within the genre of science fiction, only the connotation of its electric voice with psychological stress. This film allowed the theremin to declare a new theme peculiar to the science fiction film, but also draw on prior associations, alien visitation. The use of this unusual instrument, paired with the xenomorphic fear it created, came hand in hand, especially with the extraterrestrials having their own language. The Day the Earth Stood Still does this through the characterization of Klaatu, with his imperative, Glort Klaatu Bara Nikito. Day the Earth Stood Still specifically, music actualizes the alien psychotechnological interface that links Klaatu with his technology. Klaatu executes control over the ship both by verbal commands issued in his native language and by waving his hands at doors, etc. With these gestural controls, Klaatu at times suggests he is nothing less than a thereminist, as the instrument is featured prominently during such scenes. But the theremin is as contextual as it is suggestive. It sonifies the mysterious alien technologies and incomprehensible power sources without ever becoming a diegetic element. 26 years later came the birth of one of the most iconic and most prolific franchises of sci-fi, George Lucas's Star Wars, beginning with A New Hope in 1977, the first film in what was soon to change the sci-fi genre, which came with a plethora of iconic sound effects alongside it, ranging from the lightsaber, iconic sidekicks, and the antagonist of Darth Vader himself. When it comes to the fantasy creatures of Star Wars, specifically now looking at R2-D2, one of the most iconic and well-recognised characters within today's modern media. Bert stated that R2's voice turned out to be one of the most prolonged and difficult sounds to develop, but that was the hardest task I had on Star Wars. There hadn't been any sort of film before that had a main character that didn't speak a word of English, and so in order to get characterization across, improvisation was key, with George Lucas himself even suggesting that they should record babies speaking right before they even start forming words. In order to achieve the whirs and bips that come from the androids, Bert himself overlaid himself doing vocalizations at the same time as playing a keyboard on an old ARP synthesizer. Through a lot of practice came something that sounded expressive. Finally, in 2013 came Alfonso Cuarón's Gravity, featuring one of the most innovative and inventive sound mixes, one that breaks modern movie convention in significant ways. Within the film, space is entirely silent, as if you're encompassed in a vacuum, with the dialogue whirring around the audiences in an immersive 360-degree cyclone of sound design, allowed by the advances of Dolby Atmos. Sound designer Glenn Fremantle decided on the sound design through the perspective of touch and vibration and contact throughout the entire film, which became the concept and the entirety of the film. The fear of the void and space itself as one never-ending black beyond, at 372 miles above the earth with nothing to carry sound. Technique created tension with audiences as the sounds that are included are extremely heightened, such as Sandra Bullock's heartbeat and breath throughout, with the only sound being heard through human connection and touch. Sound editor Skip Levinsky said that sound is like a comfort layer we all take for granted. It helps us figure out what to do. When you remove that, it's like a huge safety net you're removing. This is exactly what Gravity did, changing the sound for all sci-fi films before it to create the sound of silence in the massive vacuum that is space. In one of the most pivotal scenes where Bullock's character is hung up on a parachute, sound was achieved by using the technique of Foley. Fremantle and his team visited a studio outside Paris where they submerged guitars in water. Recording with underwater microphones called hydrophones, as well as contact mics, they rubbed different items along the guitar strings. Some of these recordings became the sounds audiences would hear during this scene. In conclusion, throughout the journey of sound first emerging in cinema with the jazz singer, to the technological advancements of Dolby being able to create an entire narrative in Gravity, focusing around the sound of silence, it's clear to see that within the industry, not only that of just science fiction has come a long way in its development. Sound is an ever-evolving craft and practice, with science fiction being an ever more popular genre with the likes of that of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's no telling what the future of cinema sound may bring us. You ain't heard nothing yet.